إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله. All thanks and praise are due to Allah. We seek His help and forgiveness, and we seek refuge in Allah from the evil within ourselves and the consequences of our evil deeds. Whoever Allah guides will never be led astray, and whoever Allah leads astray will never find guidance. I bear witness there is no God but Allah, alone without any partners, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is His servant and His messenger. The greatest crime of all is that which a man commits when he denies the very existence of his own Creator, the one who gave him his very life, the one by whose leave he acquires the very air he breathes. The very air he breathes. No injustice, no ingratitude, no offense even begins to compare to that. Whatever you do against a creature like yourself, no matter how atrocious, how deeply unfair, would pale in comparison. Bear in mind that it is not the painfulness or harmfulness of the deed to one or more creatures like yourself that determines its magnitude in this respect. The gravity of that deed, in this case, comes from a fundamentally different consideration. If it is unfair and unjust to harm a fellow creature for no reason, although no creature could reasonably claim any existential dues from you, none of them could ever claim a position where you owe them your very existence. Imagine what it would be like to commit the ultimate offense against your very own Maker. Imagine the greatest thing you've ever owed anyone. Now multiply that 1,000-fold, and you're not even close. 1,000,000,000-fold, and you're not close. 1,000,000,000,000-fold, not by a long shot. The blessings and alms of your Maker are mind-bogglingly uncountable, so don't even bother. You are here, living, breathing, seeing stuff, hearing stuff, doing stuff, ultimately thanks to Him. He is the Supreme Being who actually drove all causes in the universe such that you be what you are and have what you have, not otherwise. It could have easily been otherwise. Not once did some event occur that would prevent your parents, for instance, from even meeting before having you. And none could possibly happen because He had already chosen for the world and its laws to run the way that they did, not otherwise, bestowing upon you, among countless other things, the blessing of your very own birth. Can you imagine yourself not having been born at all? He could easily have chosen that, you know. You see now what I mean when I say you cannot even begin to thank Him enough for all He has given you and continues to give you. Oh no, you don't. The magnitude of His debt upon our shoulders is indeed far beyond our limited imagination, simply unfathomable. Imagine every good thing that has ever happened to you or come your way, and remember how easily it could have been otherwise, how easily it could have been made such that you don't get it or even come close to getting it. Imagine all the people you love and what your life would be like if you haven't even ever met them before. Better still, imagine every bad thing that has ever happened to you, and imagine how much worse it could have been for you. Whatever it is, there could be worse. Much worse indeed. In a great many cases, you have no idea how much worse things could have been for you. How much worse things could have been for you have they happened the way you had wished them to happen. Little did you know what's really and truly best for you and what could really cause it to unfold on the long run. Now contemplate on that, keeping in mind that He teaches through His messengers that those believers who pass His test of pain or misfortune will earn unimaginably large bounties in the afterlife in reward, eternal bounties that do not perish, do not instill boredom or worry or unrest in any way, ones that only He can create and keep. It follows by necessity, by the necessity of His being your Creator and Sustainer, the ultimate source of all that exists, that He should be the only being you could beseech for your needs and wants, believing that if He chooses to fulfill them to you, then nothing and nobody could possibly keep them from you, and that if any harm or foul is nigh upon you, and He has decreed that it shall indeed befall you, then no power in the universe could stop that from happening. How can anything challenge the very source of all laws, all natures, all causes, and all creation, the one by whose decree everything is the way it is, not otherwise? Can you begin to imagine now the magnitude of the crime one commits by denying him his due thanks, not to mention denying him the right that his existential debt upon you be acknowledged at all? What bigger crime could anybody possibly commit against anybody? Now, one of the major problems of our times is that in contemporary Western culture, you could easily get away with this monumental offense without even getting recognized as making a religious statement of any sort. All you need to do is present it as a declaration of a scientific proposition or a scientific position. What we observe or can observe potentially is all there is to reality. What we observe is all there is to reality. Nothing does or can exist beyond nature. One of the greatest travesties of our time is that such a claim is not viewed as a fundamentally religious statement. It's the backbone of modern science. If you disagree with it, then by definition, you are a superstitious crackpot who wishes to make people believe things on unscientific grounds. And if your claim or proposition does in fact qualify as unscientific, God forbid, then not only does it not merit any serious consideration, it doesn't even qualify as a knowledge claim to begin with. So what's going on here? Have people really forgotten that natural science is by definition a discipline of knowledge that addresses only the observable part of reality, namely nature, not all of reality? Well, no, they haven't. They would insist that this be the case in every occasion. Okay? That what science does. Experts and lay people all the same, they would agree to that. So what is it then? How does a discipline that is exclusively about the natures of things that we observe in the world become the sole authority of knowledge about all that exists in reality? Could or could not exist? It becomes that way only under the tenets of an actual religion that those doing the science itself happen to ascribe to, unwittingly sometimes, most of the time even. Yeah, a religion, in every sense of the word, despite nobody wishing to admit to calling it that. The religion in question here is commonly called in philosophical circles metaphysical naturalism. It is simply the belief that nature is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Or to quote Carl Sagan, as he famously put it, the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Now, that such a statement of faith, which is what it is, be propagated so easily, so casually, through an episode of a famed and highly influential show on science and the popularization of science, without anybody even bothering or objecting to responding, to object or respond, is quite telling indeed. It tells of the sad state of affairs that the Western culture has come to with respect to such a false belief system, one that has no grounds at all, not in science nor in any other discipline of human knowledge whatever. And yet it continues to dominate upon all Western academies of natural science as though it was indeed a question of irrefutable fact. The belief is not only unscientific and groundless, it is decidedly irrational. It's the wishful thinking of an atheist metaphysician. They simply wish that it were indeed the case that only nature exists. The reason they wish it is simply because if it were indeed true, then they would have no obligation or moral responsibility whatsoever to commit themselves to a religion that is ascribed to their maker. A religion that rightfully claims to be revealed from the Creator should be, by definition, the single most authoritative source of knowledge about all the major questions that define our very existence in this world as humans. Period. There can be no refuting or questioning this fact. Thus it became clear early on to ancient Greek philosophers that if they wished to overcome that authority, then they could take one of two routes. A, to debunk a particular religion, the prevailing religion of the times, in which case another religion would simply hold the torch and take its place and claim rightfulness. And the philosopher would then have to spend their entire lives pretending to be in search for that one religion, okay? Comparing religions and stuff like that. There are countless religions in the world. Or B, to defeat the entire concept of revelation itself, thereby rendering any claim of truthfulness of a particular religion that ascribes itself to the maker vacuous and unsustainable. Okay, and how do we go there? Well, let's pretend that we can come up with claims about reality and existence that are rational, scientific, at least according to the standards of the time, and plausible, wherein there can be no room for a being such as God. If we can show such a being to be categorically irrational, then not only will we defeat all claims of revealed religion, we will even force the followers of all such religions to hold our theories as the only authoritative knowledge in such matters, in place of whatever they had to teach in their books, whatever the books were telling them. So the thought was not originally that we need to argue in favor of belief that only nature existed, nothing else, and nothing beyond. No, that wasn't it. Nobody ever did that as such. It rather originated as an epistemic principle about what can or cannot be known to exist in reality, and the proper way to investigate such issues, to investigate its existence. The theory of knowledge, so to speak, that was how it all started. The philosophers started to teach people that it is okay to propose theories about all of reality, theories that categorize all things that exist by determining natures and properties of things by the very merit of their existence. If it does exist, then it has to be either of type A or of type B, or a composition thereof of two types or more. That would be taken as the scientific explanation of the very notion of existence. If it exists, then this is how we explain why it exists, or how it exists. The philosophical account of reality, all of reality, okay, that's what this theory should offer. Things are by virtue of the way they are, or rather by virtue of what the philosopher proposes them to really be like. Something is real only because it is as such and such. Otherwise, we couldn't be justified in describing it as real, right? It thus followed that the philosopher would give themselves the right to redefine the very meanings of meanings of words commonly used in daily discourse, to only apply to something if and only if it is the way their theory would hold it to be. The meaning would only apply to something that exists in reality if and only if it is the way that their theory would hold it to be. If it is this way, then it does exist. If it's not, then it cannot exist. All right? Something exists in a place, for example, if and only if the nature of that thing is such and such, and thus the word place itself would be redefined to mean that and only that. Okay? The same is true of time, of motion, of change, etc., which would consequently strip the creator of nature itself from all his attributes, whatever the theory teaches about the natures of things, since place, for example, would only be a property of things of this world, things that fall under the metaphysical analogy that the theory proposes, whatever that may be. If it is only true of something to have place as an attribute, if it is composed of such and such, as the theory would teach, and the creator is by basic definition not something of this world, is not made of that composition, then he should not have place or anything in its meaning among his attributes. Thus the conclusion would be that if you insist on embracing such a theory while still believing in some creator or maker of the world, then it would have to be an abstract entity that is to be described by the meaning and its diametric opposite simultaneously. Your God would have to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Why? Because to say that he is everywhere would be to attribute place to him, and the theory forbids that. And to say he is nowhere would be to blatantly deny his existence altogether. So what's the way out? You go figure, okay? This is why the Greeks would claim that their metaphysics follows their physics. The metaphysics comes after the physics, which is why they call it metaphysics. Okay, when in fact their entire belief system follows their metaphysical / physical metaphors and analogies, from which all meanings about reality are to be obtained by deductive entailment. That's how it actually worked. Okay, this muddy, ambiguous, tenuous boundary between physics and metaphysics in ancient Greek thought is directly responsible for the sad state of affairs I described earlier. The way we think about the world itself. If the physical theory would come out to encompass all that is out there anyway, okay, all that is out there, all that exists, things of the world are as such and such by virtue of their very existence, of their very being, okay, then what is metaphysics really, if not precisely this? If this is not metaphysics, then what is metaphysics? They would make such outrageous propositions about reality and pretend that we see things around us the way they are because the proposition is true. And that's it. That's science for you folks. You want to theorize about what different types of things are made of, or how the world works, or why the natures of things are the way they are, rather than otherwise? That's what your theory should be like. This Greek principle of metaphysical physical theory, which lies at the very foundation of Western academia, was the first major crime that those philosophers of old committed against human thought. And yes, I'm claiming it, and I'm calling it a crime, and I do not shy away from that, because this is what it really was. That a human being would give themselves the right to make all-encompassing universal claims about things that exist, why they exist, what they must be made of if they do exist, based on analogies to certain compositions of things that fall within their limited human experience. This is by all means an intellectual offense, intellectual crime. And yet, it was embedded within the scholastic practice of those philosophers of old in a way that made metaphysics practically indistinguishable from physics. When it comes to the general assumptions underlying both enterprises, the general predisposition was one of universality. If your theory does not address the entirety of reality, it is not worth the while. And it is obvious why it has to be so. If we're going to pull the rug from underneath the feet of those people teaching about the gods and their dues in the temple, then we must propose theories that address all things that exist, in what would then claim the position of the only rational authority in what can and cannot exist at all. Plato makes his famous allegory of the cave precisely to teach this, to show lay people that a well-learned philosopher is the only true authority of knowledge about what is out there, if indeed such an authority is to be found anywhere. He is the only one with the tools, the rational tools, to tell you people what exists, why it exists, and what it is like, without having to actually walk out of the cave. Okay, and while it is true that proper induction would allow you to predict and to reasonably expect what should come next in our human experience, induction was by no means the basis for ancient Greek science, if it is to be called that. Whatever they claimed to know about reality did not rely on induction essentially, but on metaphysical analogy and metaphor. Of course, there were claims that emerged from experience concerning medicine and the likes, but that was not the backbone of what science really was. That was not the backbone of how they thought about reality. And when eventually the Western Academy was introduced to systematic experimentation and inductive argumentation, which was basically the province of Muslim scholars like Ibn al-Haytham, rahimahullah, it was too late to reconsider the principle of metaphysical theory, since the Academy was already founded on that metaphysical principle. There was no way that anybody would even dare propose that science be done in a way that rendered the entire Greek legacy of science bonkers. The Aristotelian notion of what substance is, for example, cannot be rebuked, just because we've learned to do a more careful examination, or more systematic examination of what we really observe and make deductions and draw conclusions out of that. The physics simply has to be proposed within the framework of metaphysics, whatever that was, as the good philosophers of old would teach. Otherwise, we would only be left with limited inductions that only tell us about this small part of the world that human experience spans, both in time and in space. Now, no philosopher would be satisfied with such a limitation. My theory has to encompass all things, all that actually exists, or it would be no good. It wouldn't grant me the seat of intellectual power and authority that I desire. It wouldn't force those followers of prophets and ancient books to come learn from me what can or cannot exist in reality. They should be taught that without my theory, whatever the prophets teach them would have no rational grounds whatever, if any is to be sought at all. Now, I am not claiming that that's what any of them said, those philosophers. I'm only explaining where the concept of metaphysical theory must have come from, which is, in turn, where metaphysical naturalism comes from. Alright? The metaphysical principle of thinking about the world is the very foundation of methodological naturalism. If a theory can be made to propose a detailed description and explanation of what is real per se, and moreover, the theory appears to be working just fine in predicting things about the world, then it must be true that nature is all there is, and all we need to appeal to in learning about reality. Okay? This reasoning is, of course, as circular as it gets. All right? To justify naturalism by this thinking and to justify this thinking by naturalism, that's all circular. Really, if you think about it, you start by assuming everything to be the way you propose as an explanation for what you observe, and then you take those very same observations as evidence for the validity of that proposition itself that you made. Okay, a classical case of if A then B, B then A, right? It was thus inevitable that natural philosophers would decide they have no room in their theories for anything supernatural, if indeed it has become manifestly true that a philosopher can compose an entire worldview about reality and the way things work without appealing to anything unobservable or beyond the observable in any sense, then this must be the way to go. But guys, you have never even attempted to justify this basic metaphysical principle of theory itself. It obviously presupposes the belief that only nature and natural things do exist. It does not entail it like many would think. It does not entail that belief. Okay, many atheists would claim, like Richard Dawkins or Sean Carroll and others would claim, blatantly I may add, that this conclusion, this belief that nature is all there is, based on what science has achieved in recent times. And that's definitely not the case. That's the exact opposite of what things have been like. Okay, science worked the way that it did. It plunged itself into such topics as it did address, not because of the discoveries and the great achievements of the science, but because of the naturalism itself that underlied it, the naturalistic belief system, the tenets of naturalism. Okay, it were presupposed in the practice of the Western academy, and that's why science went the way that it did. It obviously presupposes the belief that only nature and natural things exist. The practice itself presupposes that. It does not entail it like many people would think or claim. It presupposes it. No, okay? Except it was only relatively recently that philosophers started to flesh it out as credible belief system. Naturalism. The thinking goes something like this. We have gone quite far in establishing the worldview of naturalism, so it must be true. If we can indeed make it so delicate, so sophisticated, so mathematically elegant a view, then it must be the truth. And again, we say, far from it. No, it mustn't. To ascribe to a certain belief just because it fits or because it looks good or because the alternative would simply be far too complicated. This is currently the prevailing method of picking and choosing from competing theories in much of what is called science today, precisely because of this fundamental fallacy, fundamental false belief system, fundamentally false. If the subject matter of your theory is ultimately unobservable, like for example there is no way that we can ever come to observe it at all, then you obviously have no grounds from induction or experience to even begin to hypothesize on explanations for it in the first place. Hypothesize an explanation for it in the first place. We shall come to that issue later on, inshallah ta'ala, but let's just say for now that there are certain subject matters in modern science that can only qualify as unwarrantable metaphysical theory in reality. The reason for this, as I have just explained, goes all the way back to antiquity, to the founding fathers of modern Western academy. What I tried to sketch thus far, as briefly as I could in the previous analysis, is the reason why naturalism is the only religion in the history of all belief systems that was never called or identified as such in Western thought, was never called a religion, and probably never will be. If it is indeed the underlying assumption beneath all of science, then how can anybody dare to even suggest that it is in fact nothing more than a religious belief? Huh? If philosophers have actually invented that methodological naturalism, precisely to eschew or filter out all things religion, then how come it turns out to be a religious commitment in itself after all? Okay, that would be the thinking, that would be the objection to what I'm saying here. Well, if you think about what it really is and what it does and what religious commitment is, as I've just mentioned briefly, then it stands to reason that it should constitute an alternative religion. Okay, that's what it's come to take place of, really. One that no matter what religious affiliation you may exhibit, you cannot become a respectable scientist in Western academia if you are not willing to compromise by embracing that religion along with your own, or that belief system along with your own. Okay? And if you have trouble making ends meet, making both religions fit as compatibly as they should with each other, then it should be obvious which of the two religions is at fault. Okay? Now, look at the title of this book by Richard Dawkins. The Magic of Reality, How We Know What's Really True. How we know what's really true. Now, look at it and tell me that this is not a book of metaphysics. I mean, it probably includes quite a lot of science, of scientific facts and observations all the way through, as you would expect, knowing who the other is. But the title is obviously not what science is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to teach you. Science is supposed to be about what is true of the natures of the world as we experience them. That's what science tells us. That's what science can tell us. Okay, the natures of those types of matter and of life that we have come to learn and to experience. We've come to learn about and to experience in this part of the world that we live in. The reality of the observable world, so to speak. But that's not what the book is about. It is here to teach you how we know what is truly real. Period. What truly exists, all of reality, all that is real. The assumption is thus, if it is real, if it is truly real, then science is the way to learn about it. Okay, and the book here will attempt to show you that this fact makes the world even more magical than other religions would have you believe. Whatever he means by magical. Whatever he means. So, judging by the title alone, you can easily tell that the book will not teach you about science. It will teach you that the subject matter of science is all of reality, is all that exists. Nothing really or truly exists that science cannot tell you about. Okay, in principle. But is this very claim a claim of science? Absolutely not. It's a metaphysical belief, namely naturalism. The message is essentially evangelical in its nature even. The author is here to spread the word. Oh, behold, people of the world, science is finally here. It will save you all from the myths and superstitions that all religions have been teaching you for ages, and finally give you the joy of knowing what is really true. That's it. That's the mission. Okay, so if anything, such literature should be called naturalistic evangelism, really, rather than science popularization or pop science or whatever, or the likes, because that's what it really is. Dawkins starts the book with a chapter that he entitles, What is Reality? What is Magic? Now, a scientist's job is not to come up with a metaphysical definition of reality as such. His job is not to explain to us what the word reality means or what entities can or cannot be called real. This is supposed to be nobody's job, actually, since no sensible human being actually needs or to acquire a definition of reality. Okay, if by reality we mean all that is real or all that exists, then anybody who knows the language should already know what it means. Okay, however, this is the kind of damage that metaphysical theory does to language itself. Reality is no longer just that abstract meaning in our minds that applies equally to anything that actually exists out there, whatever its nature is or whatever it's like. It becomes something physical and has physical properties. Reality is the relativistic space-time that envelopes the entirety of our universe. If something is claimed to exist outside of space-time, it is claimed to exist somewhere that is actually nowhere. Okay? It is in a place that is not a place. Now, could such a thing qualify then as real? Depends on what physicist you ask. If you ask one who embraces some cosmological model that proposes non-classical time, where some eternal quantum gravitation regime is claimed to have taken hold before the Big Bang, then yeah, you could potentially call it real. Okay, then there would be some meaning in saying something happened or existed before the Big Bang. Okay, if, however, you embrace a model, or you ask someone who embraces a model that holds the Bang to be the start of all nature, not just this particular universe we live in, and classical time to be all time, okay, there would be no sense or meaning in time beyond space-time, then you couldn't call it real. In other words, nothing can exist before the Big Bang, because then the very word before would lose its meaning. There would be no meaning in the word. Okay, so if reality as such is to be defined following the theory along with terms like time, before, and the likes, then obviously we are talking metaphysical theory here, guys, not empirical or science. Thanks to the philosophical legacy of the Greeks, modern Western academy now teaches its students that this is indeed science. It is a scientific discussion. Okay, some may in fact identify it as philosophical, but who cares? Okay, if it goes underneath science and science is running with presupposition, with the presupposition of its validity, then it's out of the question. Nobody should even bother discussing it. Nobody should even bother questioning. Or if you nonetheless insist on musing about it and thinking about what these meanings really mean or what they true, you should take science as the grounds of what you're thinking. Okay, what science has achieved should not be questioned. Okay, you should build upon it. You should build your philosophical considerations on top of it. Okay, you should build them on it. Okay, you shouldn't even question the very basic foundations of those discoveries or those achievements or those whatever you may call them that science has come to give us. Okay. So thanks to the philosophical legacy of the Greeks, modern Western academy now teaches its students that this is indeed science, or this is what science presupposes, and since science works, and since science is good, since science is true by definition, then okay, this has to be true. Any presupposed belief has to be true as well. Okay, by entailment. A theory is not really a theory in science unless it addresses all things that may exist. Things of the same type, I mean. Things that must exist and things that cannot exist. The topology, the categorical considerations of existing things. That's what science has started to be doing, to be like ever since the times of the Greeks. This is what Thomas Kuhn would identify as a scientific paradigm. This is what he would identify as a scientific paradigm. The physics and the metaphysics that underlies it. A scientific revolution, thus, is what happens, according to him, when fundamentally different metaphysical theories come to take hold of the steering wheel of science. This is why Dawkins feels quite comfortable in addressing such a question in a book about science, and no fellow scientist or even philosopher would find it to be an unscientific question in any way. In fact, the question about what reality is, that is. In fact, most of what Dawkins has done in his very own career was never really science truly to begin with. Evolutionary biology is not science, really. It is a naturalistic myth on the origins of all species, one that is far more sophisticated and detailed and backed by scientific interpretations of observations than any origins myth that was ever conceived in history. But thanks to naturalism and its metaphysical presuppositions, the Academy has agreed to define science in such a way that such issues would become a fundamental part of it, that such theories would become a fundamental part of it, component in it. So what is reality? It is some physical, it's some physical entity that encompasses the entirety of the universe, like some sort of manifold with a fabric where all things are suspended. This is today's scientific account of the matter. This is what a scientist would tell you what reality is. They would even call it the fabric of reality. Okay, this is an entirely metaphysical term. It's not scientific. It's not science. Okay, now let's take a look at what he actually says here, at what Dawkins says. Reality is everything that exists. All right, that sounds straightforward, doesn't it? Actually, it isn't. There are various problems. What about dinosaurs? Which once existed but exist no longer? What about stars, which are so far away that by the time the light reaches us, we can see them, they may have fizzled out. He goes on to say, but are we only going to call something real if we can detect it directly with one of our 5 senses? What about distant galaxy? What about a distant galaxy, too far away to be seen with the naked eye? What about bacterium, too small to be seen without a powerful microscope? Must we say that these do not exist because we can't see them? No, obviously we can enhance our senses through the use of special instruments, telescopes for the galaxy and microscopes for the bacteria. Because we understand telescopes and microscopes and know how they work, we can use them to extend the reach of our senses, in this case the sense of sight, and what they enable us to see. convinces us that galaxies and bacteria exist. What they enable us to see convinces us that galaxies and bacteria exist. He continues, how about radio waves? Do they exist? Our eyes can't detect them, nor can our ears. But again, special instruments, television sets, for example, convert them into signals that we can see and hear. Okay? So although we can't see or hear radio waves, we can't see or hear them, we know they are part of reality. He then rambles about dinosaurs and how we know they existed, and then goes on to say, are there really aliens in outer space? We've never seen or heard them. Are they part of reality? Nobody knows. But we do know what kind of things could one day tell us if they are. If ever we got near to an alien, our sense organs could tell us about it. Perhaps somebody will one day invent a telescope powerful enough to detect life on other planets from here. Or perhaps our radio telescopes will pick up messages that could only have come from alien intelligence. For reality doesn't just consist of the things we already know about, it also includes things that exist but that we don't know about yet, and won't know about until some future time, perhaps when we have built better instruments to assist our five senses. Atoms have always existed, but it was only rather recently that we became sure of their existence, and it is likely that our descendants will know about many more things that for now we do not. That is the wonder and the joy of science. It goes on and on, uncovering new things. This doesn't mean we should believe just anything that anybody might dream up. There are a million things we can imagine which are highly unlikely to be real. Fairies and hobgoblins, leprechauns and hippogriffs. We should always be open-minded, but the only good reason to believe that something exists is if there is real evidence that it does. Alright, there you have it. The only good reason to believe that something exists is if there is real evidence that it does. And what is real evidence, mind you? What would qualify as real evidence for you? According to his fascinating analysis we just quoted, real evidence is either direct observation, aided or magnified or enhanced observation, as he calls it, or of course, theory-interpreted observation. Alright? By theory-interpreted observation, I mean such observations that theorists would interpret in such a way as to support or serve their theories about the unobservable one way or another. Like the way he would claim that we know that humans descended from hominids or higher apes, for example, or that the universe is the lucky spawn of an accidental Big Bang. And that's it. That's what qualifies as real evidence in his belief system. Something exists and can be known to be real and to exist if and only if it can be shown to exist or to have existed or happened through one of those three routes. Okay? See how wonderful and magical science is? Rejoice and have fun. You just need to observe it or deduce it from observation. That's it. But then again, this is not science he is teaching here, folks. Obviously, it isn't. This is the doctrine of naturalism. What he's trying to convince you here, what he's trying to pass on to you is the doctrine of naturalism, not science. The metaphysical belief that only what can be shown through the scientific method to exist does indeed exist. That's not a scientific position. It's an article of faith, naturalistic belief, naturalistic faith. Alright? Watch how he starts by stating that reality is everything that exists. Then he indulges the reader by suggesting that there are certain problems with how that reality is discovered, only to proceed happily and explain what scientists do to learn about the world, and that whatever they fail to observe immediately, they either resort to aiding devices to help them with, or they come up with theories that fit the data, or they just wait for future generations to come up with the technology needed for better observation, which he believes rather prophetically that they will eventually. Alright? For reality doesn't just consist of the things we already know about, it also includes things that exist but that we don't know about yet and won't know about until some future time, he says. And what makes him so confident? Atoms have always existed, but it was only rather recently that we became sure of their existence, and it is likely that our descendants will know about many more things that, for now, we do not. Alright? And how exactly, pray tell, did you know that atoms have always existed? Well, he didn't. Nobody does. He just relies on a metaphysical extrapolation of the here and the now to cover all places and all times. Even his firm assertion that we are sure that atoms exist relies actually on the interpretation of the deflection of a ray of electrons by what is believed to be the atom. What is believed, what is interpreted to be the atom. All right? So to be honest, one should state clearly that nobody has ever observed an atom in the sense that he seems to imply, and nobody knows what that unit of chemical interaction really is. All we have are mental constructs or models of what it must be made of based on how it behaves under different conditions and circumstances. A geometric analogy at best, right? A good one, perhaps, for all intents and purposes, but an analogy nonetheless. What we have here, however, is an attempt to present such an analogy under which all observations are interpreted as direct observation that cannot be reasonably doubted or questioned. Okay, this is so sickening, guys. This is so unhealthy, even for science itself. Okay, but why is he doing so? Because he is in the business of converting people to a new religion. That's why he does this. A religion that seeks to install scientific theories in a place that has been occupied previously by nothing less than Scripture. Those of you who would still insist that their Scripture is teaching the truth about Adam and Eve, for example, need to have all the reasons in the world to convert from that faith, or at least from that particular belief, to another belief system where science provides unquestionable truth claims, or at least the only claims that have the potential of being unquestionably true on the origins of the humankind. Okay. However, authentic Scripture is by definition infallible. Okay. If it is indeed authentic Scripture, then it follows by necessity that it is infallible. While good science is clearly not. Good science cannot acquire this rational position. Yet, this is not the kind of book where you would be interested in showing that science is indeed fallible and challengeable, more so in certain fields of it than others. As a preacher of naturalism, you would need to maintain an overarching impression, to convey an overarching impression that science is the only way to know about things, is the only way to know anything about reality. And that even if we suffer faults and gaps now in our knowledge, then we can rest assured that our descendants will finish the job for us. And whatever the case may be, this is still way better than the stuff that Scripture teaches. Okay, that the Church tells you. You would have to make this undeniable fallibility of science, which in fact reaches the point where the theory is indeterminable by observation in all issues that have to do with the big questions, a praiseworthy feature of science, before someone raises it against you. A feature that inspires awe and wonder, and needs to be celebrated, since it leaves people wishing to do more and more science all the time to finally acquire a scientific account of reality where religion used to reign. Okay? After all, such a book is written to plunge science into such issues, not to push it out of them. Questions like the origins of our kind, the origins of the world, and all that's in it, what was before the world, what came to be before the world, what would be its fate, and what the fate of our kind will be, all such major questions must be popularized as questions of science. Not because it is rational or reasonable for them to be addressed by the scientific method in the first place, but because methodological naturalism, which is one of the major tenets of the doctrine of naturalism, dictates that. Nobody dares to even suggest that there are no solid grounds of reason beneath the belief that science is actually the proper way to learn about events that are not of this world at all, ones that made it the way that it is rather than otherwise, or that would unfold after the world itself as we know it is no longer there. The idea that if indeed there was anything at all before this world, or there is anything at all beyond it, then it is only through science that we could find out, rests on nothing but a religious belief, guys. The belief that nature is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Nothing exists but the natural. only stuff that run under those laws that we know through experience. Only such stuff does exist. And if indeed one is to be justified in believing that at some point in the far past or in the far future the laws would be different than they are now, the laws of nature, then it has to be the scientific model itself that we propose to explain those laws that tells us so. This should be the only way that you can come up with such a conclusion. The relativistic model, you come up with such knowledge, as they would call it. The relativistic model of universal gravitation, for example, depicts a universe that must have been expanding from eternity, leading inexorably to a past singularity. Then that's what we should believe about its origins. Okay? No one, that's the scientific account of its origins. No one would dare at this point in history argue that the equation could easily be manipulated in a way that rules out the expansion altogether, like Einstein himself originally wrote it. Okay? Better still, no one would dare argue that there is no rational footing for the belief that the law of gravitation applies to all parts of the universe, the observable and beyond, in exactly the same manner. You have to presuppose that belief if you wish to theorize about the universe at its entirety. But what grounds do you really have for that belief itself? None whatsoever. When Newton laid out his gravitational law, he looked up in the skies and thought, but if the law applies equally to all celestial bodies, and the universe is nothing more than a sea of celestial bodies running around like we observe in this part of the heavens that we see above us, then it must follow that the universe should collapse onto itself at some point. Alright? So what's the way out of this pickle, Newton? He figured that it must be infinite in size and expanse rather than finite, because only then would gravitational forces balance out in a way that keeps it from collapsing. Nobody ever dared suggest that this is a rationally questionable way to be thinking about the world around us, one that only comes from a Greek legacy of metaphysical theory that forbids the mind from observing any limits or bounds to the quest of learning about reality through reasoning. Essentially, Newton believed that if it does exist in reality, whatever it is, then it has to be matter, and it has to be subject to the laws of gravity. Anything, anywhere, at any time must be subject to the law of gravity. On what grounds of reason is a man justified in believing that? This is a metaphysical belief that has no basis but pure assertion. If it is indeed the case that nowhere have we ever encountered a place where gravity does not hold, then it must be the case that nowhere in reality could we expect to find a place where gravity does not hold. Now, this is not induction, guys, or justifiable analogy. This is metaphysical reasoning. All right? It has to be so, because otherwise we could not come up with beliefs about all of reality, about everything that exists, everything that satisfies the very meaning of real. And if we are going to challenge followers of religions that ascribe to proclaimed revelation on grounds that leave them wanting epistemologically, then we have to turn that principle of metaphysical theory into a fundamental principle of academia. Okay? The ethics of academic practice should be made such that it becomes unacceptable, outrageous even, for anybody to even begin to suggest such a limitation to the reach of human reasoning, to the reach of human reason. Okay? You must be rendered an ignorant, okay, or religious zealot or something like that if you insist on limiting the way that we humans do science. Who do you think you are if you even attempt that? Newton must have been right and fully justified in contemplating about the universe in its entirety the way that he did. Otherwise, what would you have? What would you have him say? Otherwise, what would you have him say? What kind of theory would you have him propose? That the law of gravitation is only justifiably believed to apply to this observable portion of the world that we see around us and nothing more? And what about the rest of the world? What about the rest of the universe? What about the rest of all the things that exist? Whose province would that be in terms of epistemic authority? Who would tell us about it? Who would tell us what it is made of or where it comes from and what our place in the world really is? The church? God forbid. The theory, any theory, has to be universal. It has to apply to all things by the very merit of their existence in reality, or else the philosopher would still find themselves compelled to follow people with scripture. Okay? And that's precisely what they did philosophy to get out of. There must be more to reality than those commoners and lay people of religion believe. And there must be an epistemic frontier, the academy, of course, through which we could convince those people that this is indeed the case, and that if we think hard enough, if those that are brightest among us think hard enough, we should be able to learn more about reality as such than what those commoners and ignorant followers of religion are satisfied with. If we manage to do that, then we would have won the intellectual battle on who has the right to call unto people to follow their way before it even begins. If people start to believe that this is knowledge, that this is science, and this is what reasonable and rational people have to believe about reality and what it is made of and what is out there, then anything that the religions teach them that does not conform to it, and any scripture that cannot be interpreted in a way that suits it, will be rendered false by definition, okay, from the word go, before any debate even begins to unfold. So what bigger victory could they possibly wish for? Okay, think about it. If the question of higher epistemic authority is already settled in their favor, then all people of religion will have to follow them on those questions, those major questions, regardless of what they find in those religions, with nothing more than a pale, feeble attempt of many of them to show that their authoritative texts are in no contradiction with prevailing theories, whatever they happen to be. Okay? Now, that would be all they could afford to do intellectually to keep people from converting out of the religions and into atheism. Okay, into pure, blunt naturalism. This is why naturalism and its basic tenets have to continue to remain hidden under the pretext of science. This is why you will never find a preacher of naturalism who admits that what he is actually popularizing is naturalism, not science. Okay, although it has in fact started to happen recently in people like Sean Carroll and the likes. The term naturalism would automatically repel people and make them feel like you are selling them goods that defeat the religions from the word go. This is obviously not the case with the term science. Naturalism is a religion. It has come to be, of course, viewed as synonymous to atheism, while of course science is not. Okay. It is fairly obvious, given everything that we observe, and if we assume that we know nothing else from any other reliable source of knowledge, not even the fitrah that underlies our very minds, that it would be rationally possible that the laws of nature as we know them are only true of this part of the universe that we observe within the span of time that we have documented in history, not of its entirety. This would be every bit as possible as it is possible that they hold true everywhere in the universe and at all times, as naturalists have chosen to believe. So, on what grounds have they chosen to believe that to believe the latter rather than the former? What justification is there in embracing the ultimate uniformity principle along with the principle of isotropy and the cosmological principle as established facts? As crucial as this question is in demarcating science from non-science, it remains unanswered and entirely unconsidered in Western academia. Because whatever your answer is to it, it will only be a faith-based answer. Wallahu musta'an, wala hawla wala quwwata illa billah.